dreary night of November.
Welcome, Franken readers, to Sundays with Frankenstein. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach in Philadelphia, and I'll start out with a quote this time from the novel. The starry sky, the sea, and every sight afforded by these wonderful regions seems still to have the power of elevating his soul from earth. Such a man has a double existence. He may suffer misery and be overwhelmed by disappointments. Yet when he has retired into himself, he will be like a celestial spirit that has a halo around him, within whose circle no grief or folly ventures. Will you laugh at the enthusiasm I express concerning this divine wanderer? There we go. Now I'm ready. Joining me today as co-divine wanderer is actor and horror memorabilia collector Dan Hodge. Hi, Dan.
Hey, how's it going, Ed?
Good. We're coast to coast too, because you're out in San Diego right now, and we're here in Philadelphia. So a coast to coast program. My wife told me I had to say that on the show, and I agreed. I thought that was a good thing to say. So, and they're watching too. My wife and kids are watching the show downstairs, so they're reading along with Frankenstein too. I am really happy to have you on board for this voyage, Dan, and we will talk some together. We'll go through the book. Oh my gosh, we have 221 people watching us right now on Zoom. I don't know how many are watching on Facebook, and it'll be really great. Did you like the credit sequence?
I loved it. What an exciting, surprise.
Yeah, it was fun to put together. We have an end credit sequence too, so don't don't turn it off as soon as we say goodbye. Like there's a little end credits sequence we have running too. That's nice. Oh, good. A lot of people are putting in where they're watching from in the chat. I always love that. And Tucker Christine's new song, Pleated Gazelle song. It's Alive, that song is called, that he put together for this. He did the music for Sundays with Dracula too, and he was a co-host for Sundays with Dracula as well. So I love all that. I have a new suit. That suit I had on there, brand new tweed suit, custom made from Tweed Maker. I've got a new pipe, which I thought really kind of fit the mood too. That design on it looks simultaneously like electricity and also like veins and artery, so I thought this was a good Frankenstein pipe to have for the show. So are you drinking anything today?
Me?
Yes.
Yes, I have a wonderful mug of beer.
Mug of beer, like a coffee mug of beer, right?
Well, I understand we've got a sponsor, so I'm not trying to mess with any brand loyalty.
Oh, that's okay. So but we do have a sponsor and for our show, and that is Art in the Age in Philadelphia. And today's drink, which we actually unveiled online a couple days ago, is called the Divine Wanderer. They actually had a page up at Art in the Age where you could go buy the ingredients, and it sold out like immediately. So hopefully they'll have more up again. Our chat Igor, Andrew from the Rosenbach is going to put that link in the chat for you guys, and you can find it on our Facebook group as well. Check back with them when they have more of these ingredients on sale. It's really delicious. It includes this ski kluben, which is an aquavit, and then it is also this bitter milk smoked honey whiskey. Sour mix. So it's not actually any alcohol in this. This is a mixer for it. And hot water, it's really easy to make. You just, put hot water, boil some water, put it in the mug, and then add a couple shots of this and a shot of that, and whatever your taste buds do. The recipe we put on our Facebook page was 2 ounces of the aquavit and 1 ounce of the bitter milk smoked honey whiskey mix. And I did 3 ounces of Aquavit because I needed a little stronger. So Aquavit's delicious anyway. This ski club and I absolutely love, from Tamworth Distilling in New Hampshire. Its main spice is actually caraway. And traditionally Aquavit's main spice is caraway, I'm sorry. And Tamworth's version also includes a ginger twist along with cardamom, star anise, and pink peppercorn. It has a whiskey base. It's a blend of bourbon, barley, and wheat whiskey. It is outstanding to warm the bones for the winter months. I drink it straight, actually, usually. And thanks to Art and the Age for their help in designing today's cocktail. Every week we will post our new drink ahead of time. So if you want to drink the same thing I'm drinking, you can get ready for it, come up with your own version, or better yet, support Art and the Age, go to their website and buy their products. Hopefully they won't run out so quickly every single week that this goes on. But we're not just drinking here today. No, we're also talking about Frankenstein. And what we'll do every week is dissect, anatomize, dismember, and bring back to life this book by Mary Shelley, chapter by chapter, page by page, word by word, as we create our very own conversational annotation of the entire novel. We'll do this for 15 weeks. We'll spend 14 weeks on the book, and then there'll be an after show. There's a rotating set of co-hosts. Dan this week. We also have the Ghoul Guides from our Sundays with Dracula returning, Dr. Lauren Nixon and Mary Going. And we have Anastasia Klimchinskaya. I always have to say her name very slowly so I don't trip over it. Dr. Anastasia Klimchinskaya will be joining us. Some of you guys met her in Sundays with Dracula when we had our Drac Chat program. And it will be a lot of fun. And every week we have a new drink. It's a brand new drink. It's a different drink every week. So in doing this show, we at the Rosenbach asked you also to support us at the Rosenbach, which you can do by donation. And if you are not already a member, well, then please join. And this is so fortuitous. The basic membership level at the Rosenbach, and it has been for some time now, is called the Mary Shelley level. So you could all join at the Mary Shelley level and help support us. I will have a little more to say about this at the mid-break. But right now, I want to start talking about the book. I've got a new schedule. You all did, and any of you did Sundays with Dracula last year. I was a lot loosey-goosey with the schedule, and I'm keeping us on target now, though. So next week will be even a shorter intro. We had to get some extra stuff out today. But we want to talk about the book, or maybe, first, just for a minute, Dan, since you haven't, since many people are meeting you for the first time, although on the Facebook group page, we did post a little Meet Dan Hodge. Right. Tell people a little bit about your interest in Frankenstein and how you got here.
Sure. It's kind of a roundabout little story, but so for those of you who don't know me, I'm a professional actor and director in the theater. And actually, that all ties back to Frankenstein, funnily enough. When I was 8 years old, I decided that Frankenstein was the scariest monster there was. For some reason, I went through that phase where all kids go through, where they get interested in monsters. And I ventured past the young people's section in the video store, back when we went to video stores, and into the horror films. And there on the shelf it was, from 1931. And I took it home. My dad was very indulgent because he knew what I was getting into. And I sat there in the middle of the afternoon and watched it because I was determined it wasn't going to, I had to see it in the day. And this film unfolded, black and white. I'd seen very few black and white movies, of course, being a kid. And at the center of it all is this performance, this iconic performance by Boris Karloff. And I was, to say riveted doesn't do it justice. I felt so bad for him. And watching this creature navigate the world where people hated him just for what he looked like, and this incredibly deft, sensitive performance. And it's the first time this ever happened. I'm sitting there on the carpet and the movie ends and I'm leaning forward, waiting for the credits. And his name comes up on the screen. It's question mark in the opening credits, but in the closing credits, they actually list Boris Karloff. And I remember at 8, pointing at the screen and saying, whatever that guy was doing is what I want to do. And thanks to
not throwing children in lakes, but
no, well,
but the actor.
Interestingly enough, when I watched it back in, I don't know,
Ooh, you didn't see
90s,
that, did you?
that scene had been excised. Like that still hadn't been rediscovered and folded back in. But yeah, it gave me my career. Like I became an actor because of Boris Karloff in Frankenstein.
Mhm. And that kind of and not just Frankenstein, but the rest of the not the rest of them, some of the Universal monsters had that appeal to children when they started releasing them in the 50s on TV, that children really identified with these outcasts, these people who didn't quite fit in the world, just as children don't fit in the adult world.
Well, and it's something that I feel like ties into that sort of monsterdom. You know, like you've got Dracula. You know, he's forever alone in that sense. You know, like he's a bloodsucker and he's you know, a villainous character of the first order, but the loneliness that he exhibits and lives within, and the same is true of the Frankenstein monster, or the creature, as we want to say, Adam.
Well, we'll talk about all that.
Oh, of course, of course. So
Clay,
I don't want to.
Clay, somebody has a good name for him. So.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, I don't want to delve too far into it, but it also sparked a lifelong love of genre pictures, I believe they call them, you know, and horror films for those of us who actually watch the damn things.
Mm-hmm. And so you have a collection now as well, memorabilia, letters, and posters, and
I began collecting in middle, you know, I bought posters back then. You would get like trade magazines and you would go through, and, you know, now it's all online. And I wrote fan letters to people. The first fan letter that I ever wrote that was responded to was a letter to Peter Cushing, who of course is the great Baron Frankenstein of the Hammer films.
I'm looking at his picture right over my computer. I have the Hammer album out, and he's on the back of that there.
And an impossibly fine actor. Like that's the thing that to me is really interesting about these films is, you know, Cushing and Karloff and Vincent Price and, you know, any number of these actors, Bela Lugosi, of course, extremely fine actors who couldn't, they were never taken seriously by mainstream because they made horror pictures, but fine actors, every one of them.
Excellent. All righty. Well, this is going to be a lot of fun to delve into this book with you and our other co-hosts in weeks coming up. I just want to remind everybody, as most of you know, especially if you're returning from Sunset with Dracula, the chat is for you guys to talk amongst yourselves. If you're new and you're like, oh my gosh, there's already like 300 chat messages, what's going on? It's almost like a whole other show going on in the chat. So if you watch live on Zoom, you can participate in that, and it's a lot of fun. I really recommend it to people. If you're watching live on Facebook, on our live stream on Facebook right now, I can't engage with the comments of that at all because I can only do, you know, several things at once, and that is not one of them. But if you leave comments in the comment, if you put something in the comment section or a question on Facebook, I will actually answer it after the program is over. And then this, of course, will exist on we'll put this video on our website and on the Rosenbach website and the Rosenbach YouTube page, and it'll live on Facebook and all of that. If you have a question, if you're watching live on Zoom, don't leave it in the chat. I can't follow the chat. Put your questions in the Q&A box. And I see there's already a question in the Q&A box that we'll hit later. Try to put the questions in as we're going to go chronologically through the book. If you put a question up about the last part of the book right now, it might get lost. So that's it. So chat away amongst yourselves. Enjoy yourselves in the chat. Question for me or Dan about the book as we're discussing it. Put it in the Q&A, and please, I encourage questions in the Q&A. I mean, if this could just be a show answering questions, I would do that. So ask as many questions as you would like to ask. So, and I'll hit this question before we even start talking about the book, because Emily asks, does this class? Wow, is this a class? I'm drinking, I'm smoking in class. That's my kind of class. Yes, she wants to know about a particular edition. Well, I do prefer the 1818 edition, and that's what we're going to be going through because it was published in 1818 originally, and then it was published in 1823 with just some marginal, you know, edits and words and things like that Mary Shelley actually didn't do. Probably her father did. And then in 1831, she republished it and edited it. And those edits are really interesting. And some of them are great. I mean, some of the words she added are great. But I think it kind of changes the tone of the novel. And we're going to focus on the 1818 edition, but almost always I'll mention when there were changes in the text in the 1831. So that's just general edition. That's the text. I prefer the 1818. As far as a published edition, there's just so many out there, and they're all pretty good. The Oxford, I think, is really good. I think it's actually a little better than the Penguin right now, at least for the notes in it. Actually, I don't think there are any notes in the new Penguin Classics for the Frankenstein 1818. And although there is some apparatus in the back from Charles Robinson, who was a great Frankenstein scholar, and he's the one that edited the manuscript of Frankenstein. And his book, he has an edition out that is called The Original Frankenstein. And this edition I really love because it is the manuscript with Mary and Percy Shelley, and in italics in this are all the words that Percy Shelley added, because he had a different hand and they could tell the difference. And then in the back of this book, they publish a version excising all of Percy's words, and it's just Mary's, and it's pretty extraordinary to read. So Percy Shelley added he edited it with her. She really, relied on him to help her with her writing. He was, already an established poet and a great writer. And she would have been foolish not to say, hey, read this work and do this. But that was actually their relationship. They were very close and liked to work on projects together. And he really wanted her to have this. He really worked hard to help her to have this book published. And but also his contributions to it amount to about, I think, like 5,000 or so words, and like, what is this, a 70,000 word novel? I can't remember how. It's not a long novel, and he contributes about 5,000 words to it. And I'm sure there were many conversations they had over and over about what's going on and all of that he influenced as well. All that said, it's clearly her book. She's clearly the primary writer on this. This is her idea. She's put it together, and he has added things that he thought would improve the text, and she agreed and had it published that way. So this original Frankenstein edition I like very much. What are you reading, Dan? Do you have the Oxford? I forget.
Sorry, I muted myself. I'm in an Airbnb and they're playing music upstairs. Yeah, I've got the Oxford, which is rather splendid, actually.
Great intro from Nick Groom and that, yeah.
Marvelous. I mean, all of the kind of prefatory material and then the appendices are really splendid. And it's funny because when Ed asked me to do this, I was initially a little gun shy because I haven't read the book since I was in high school, and rediscovering this book as like a grown folk is kind of thrilling, actually. And the 1818 having all the, it's got, this one marks with asterisks where the additions were made in the 1833, and then those are back here in the appendices. Yeah. It's really something how muscular it is in the 1818 edition. I was reading just off the rack paperbacks back in the day. So
Laura wants me to repeat that this is the original Frankenstein, it's called, edited by Charles Robinson. And someone asked if the 1818 edition, that's what we're like, actually I'm not actually using that text, because that text is actually right from the manuscript, and the published 1818 edition is a little different. It's not hugely different, but it's a little bit different, just cleaned up and edited a little better. And you can find that online fairly easily. And I've been using I use my Norton edition, my old Norton Critical but that's only because all my notes are in it. Like, I've just filled this book with notes, and at someday I'll have to transfer them because it's starting to fall apart. But for now, all my notes are in there. So the Norton Critical edition is fine as well. So let us get started here and talk about this book. And let's actually start with the title page. And the because the title page, actually, no, we won't start with the title page, because you know what I'm going to do? Because in a little late and halfway through the show, we'll have a collection share, and then I'm going to share the image then of the title page that's in the Rosenbach's collection of the first edition. Why don't we talk about that then? We'll go with, it actually opens up with a dedication. And that is to William Godwin, author of Political Justice, Caleb Williams, etc. These volumes are respectfully inscribed by the author. And no name for the author, no name for the author on the title page, and no name for the author here. But William Godwin was Mary Shelley's father. Actually, when she first conceived of this book, she was still Mary Godwin. When her and Percy ran away, they didn't get married for a couple of years because he was still married. So she was Mary Godwin when she conceived of the novel Frankenstein and wrote most of it. And and she dedicated it to her father, which is odd. You know the story about her father and when she ran away with Percy, Dan?
No, I don't actually.
Well, when she first runs away with Percy when she's 16 and Percy's 21, I think, and married with a child and another child on the way. But she falls in love with Percy, and they believe that they're in love with each other, and Percy is not in love with his wife Harriet anymore. And there's almost no such thing as legal divorce. You just have to stay with that person. And they're young and impetuous, and they decide we're just going to run off together, and they do. And it's horrible the way Harriet gets treated, and the children. But they feel that this is the way you're supposed to live your life, that you shouldn't be bound by marriage. You shouldn't be chained to a marriage you don't want to be in, and it takes a century or more for people to finally come to their senses and say, yeah, if you're in a bad marriage, you should get out of that marriage. You should be able to get out of the marriage. Well, Percy's not able to get out of his. But when they run away, Mary's father, surprising to Mary and Percy, gets really angry and cuts her off and stops talking to her. Now, they're surprised by this because Godwin, as a political philosopher, as a radical political philosopher early in his life, wrote about how marriage was not, we lost Dan, hopefully he'll come back, that marriage is not a good institution, and it should be abolished, and marriage is akin to slavery, especially for a woman. And so they kind of thought he would be okay with it, but he actually revised those ideas of his as he got older, and especially when he met Mary Wollstonecraft and she became pregnant, and they decided they need to get married or the child will be illegitimate, and that will be a big problem in their life. So they did get married, and then the baby that they had was Mary. And but when they first ran away, he was very angry at them, and that really surprised them. So Dan's back. You missed the most important part. But I still no, you didn't. But when they ran away, her father was really angry, and they were surprised because he didn't believe in marriage. He thought marriage was slavery, and why should he be angry at them for that? But he did, and he stopped speaking to her until they did get married. But he didn't stop speaking to Percy because he needed Percy's money, or he wanted Percy to give him money. Percy, comes from, a titled family, and they had money, but Percy didn't really have access to the money because Percy was cut off by his father too for being a radical, for preaching atheism and writing about it and getting kicked out of Oxford for it and all of that. So Percy was on the outs with his family, but he could borrow against his future inheritance. Financiers would give him money as a loan, and when he would come into his inheritance one day, he would have to pay it back at some exorbitant interest rate, but it was how he could survive and get money because his parents His father wouldn't give him any money. So Mary and Percy are kind of cast off on their own. But Godwin does still keep in contact with Percy. And I also think it's a way that he's mad at his daughter, and this is how he winds up keeping in contact with her. Like, he knows what's going on all the time because he's still talking to Percy. So, but when the book comes out, they're married by the time the book comes out, and and as soon as they got married, when Percy's first wife died, she commits suicide and dies. Then they're able to get married. They get married like 2 weeks after Percy's wife commits suicide, and then they're able to be together, and Mary can be accepted. Her father accepts her again. It's the family dynamics are really complex, and we could do a 15-week show on the complex family, social, romantic entanglements of Mary and Percy and her family and his family and all the other friends they have, Byron and all those people. So, but she dedicates the novel to him, and it's to William Godwin, her father. And but as it's an anonymously published book, they don't people don't know that it's her. And some people actually think that it's Percy Shelley who has written this book, because he is a radical, thinker, poet, and he does love Godwin, and people know that he's kind of like a Godwin disciple. So it kind of makes sense for people to think, because a woman can't write a book like this, that Percy probably did. So, but he's the dedicee. And I have, at different times, there will be moments when we go through this book later that there's a lot of passages in Godwin's writings that show up in this book, that the ideas in that book really show up, especially the idea of the perfectibility of humans, of man, for Godwin is what it is, but he means humans, that people can be people are perfectible. Not that you can ever be 100% completely perfect, but you can improve and you can get better over time. He doesn't believe in that we're all corrupted. He believes that we can actually improve and be more perfect over time. And Mary plays with that idea a lot all through here. So, so we'll definitely talk about Godwin as we go through here, and we'll also talk about Mary's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, too, whose works are enormously influential on her as well. But she didn't dedicate it to her mother; she dedicated it to her father. So that's why we're starting with him first. The preface. Had you ever remember even reading this preface before, Dan? This 1818 preface?
No, never before. And in fact, when I was younger, I read it several times when I was young. And, with all the impatience that the young bring with them, I never read the preface. And funnily enough, the first time I read it, I skipped the letters.
Didn't realize it was part of the story, maybe.
As a kid, it was like, chapter 1 is where chapters start. I was like, I don't care about Walton who. Like, get out of here.
Got nothing to do with the story.
Exactly. But no, it's one of my favorite parts. I mean, it's coming back to it. It's
got a lot to do with the story, and we really love it.
And the parallel of Walton and Frankenstein is so interesting, both of whom are people, delving into the unknown and all that good stuff. And one is completely socially acceptable form of exploration, and in fact, much lauded in the period to be like an explorer who goes out to kind of like discover new territories, by comparison to Frankenstein, who dabbles in, I believe, what they came to call in the 50s, what man should not know.
Mm-hmm. And that idea it happens right away. Like literally as soon as the novel's published, people talk about it in those terms. And what's really interesting is as we go through this over time, over all these weeks, I actually don't believe that is the message of the 1818 edition. But people, the readers at the time, do come up with that as a message of the novel. So it's not like to say that that's a false message then, because people do really respond to it in that way, even though I think the text argues against that. But the 1831 edition maybe doesn't really argue against that. But this and there's two preface. There's a preface to this 1818 edition, which I'm talking about now, which starts with the event on which this fiction is founded has been supposed by Dr. Darwin and some of the physiological writers of Germany as not of impossible occurrence. There is also an 1831 introduction that Mary Shelley wrote for her 1831 edition. And we're going to cover that at some point during this run, but I'm not going to hit it today because I didn't want to have too long of a preface material before we into the book. I already wanted to be into the book half hour in, but we're only hitting the preface now. And this preface though is interesting too, because Mary didn't write it. Percy wrote the preface to the book, and Mary, and we know that, like, it's not just supposed. I think Mary even mentions it at some point. I can't remember where, that Percy wrote this introduction. So that should have some bearing on how we approach this. I'm going to there's a couple questions here that I want to make sure I keep hitting as we go along. Maybe we'll hit that one today. Somebody asked DD asks where the Godwin short on money before Mary and Percy got married. Yeah, William Godwin was, heading to the poorhouse almost always. Because he was a radical philosopher writer, and how much money they make? About as much as they would make today. So you'd need a job to support yourself while you did your writing. But he's still he's in an environment where patronage is very acceptable and much needed, and so they have a bookstore. The family owns. They have a children's bookstore that they actually operate. And they write the books and sell others as well. But Godwin doesn't make enough money. And so he absolutely needs money, and definitely before Mary and Percy get married. A couple people can't see the video, and I don't know. I can't do tech work. So while we do the show, and I hope you can work that out. So there's a question from Nicole, wants to know how Mary's father felt about the book when it was published. And I think he was enormously proud of it, especially he kind of and especially when it hits the stage and people are creating stage versions of it. And she's living in Italy, and he kind of spearheads the second edition of it to come out and does some minor editing work and has it published with her name on it this time in 1823. And I think it's clear that he is very proud of it. So especially it got some good reviews too. Some people hated it and some people wrote really good. Walter Scott wrote a good review of it. So it was he was very proud of that. So Laura asked, did I miss mentioning the 1831 introduction? You did not, Laura, who was also my cousin. We will be talking about that in a future episode. So Linda wants me to pronounce Percy's middle name Biche. As far as I know, it's Biche. Dan, do you? Percy Biche Shelley is how I
think it is Biche. Just for my contemporary comedic sensibilities, I would love it if it was Bish. Just so so that she could say Bish, please.
Yes, that would be cool. But yeah, it is Biche though. So, but we'll go with Bish then. How about we do that? So the Andrew asked, it says there's a question in the chat about in what degree do we think that maybe the dedication was a burn, was like, like she's angry or being sarcastic in her dedication. Probably not, just because, and Mary really, I mean, she still thought a lot of her father. I think she recognized that he was very responsible for any education that she did get. I mean, he was responsible for the education. She didn't get the education that men could get, but he made sure she was very well educated, and really treated her through her entire life as if you're you are super intelligent and you have a lot to offer the world, and you need to make sure you develop that. And he thought she would be a great writer, and he was right. And he helped that. He really helped that along the way. So, so that's it for questions now, because we definitely want to hit this preface written by Percy. And I got a question in the email from Adam, who gave me a question a week usually during the Dracula run. So I'll definitely get to that question in this preface. But it's, I think it's interesting how it starts. That he puts the Dr. Darwin, if you don't know, is not Charles Darwin. It's Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, who was a scientist, natural philosopher, writer, and would write these scientific treatises in poetry, in verse, like book-length poems about science. You can't get away with that now. So nobody's writing a science book in verse, but it would be cool. And he did, Erasmus Darwin, because people expected that of them. I mean, it's a way of expressing yourself that's very legitimate for even scientists. But he's actually influential in developing the ideas that would come to be evolution for his grandson and for other scientists at the time too. Were figuring out that, hey, the fossil record looks like we've been around a long time, and things developed over a long time. So so that's the reference there. But he immediately goes in this preface to, this isn't merely a weaving of supernatural terrors. It's not a mere tale of specters or enchantment. That he's trying to set it up. And then even a little later, he talks about the Iliad, the tragic poetry of Greece, Shakespeare's plays, Milton's Paradise Lost. Like, that's some pretty nice company you're putting yourself into there. Like, like that's what I'm shooting for in this book. But absolutely trying to establish that this isn't just the Gothic novel that you would buy, at the bookstores or get from the circulating libraries at the time. It's not an Anne Radcliffe Gothic novel, even though there's some scary stuff in it. That it seems that this preface wants to establish this is a book of ideas and a book of high art, not just a novel, because novels aren't high art in 1818. So.
And if I could push a bit further, there's something about it being not only a novel, but a 3-volume novel.
Yes.
Which is like even pulpier than the notion of a novel now.
A triple decker, yeah. And I'll definitely talk about that when we look at the edition later. So that Great. It is. But yeah, a triple decker novel, especially if it's going to be scary stuff, people are going to think this is just fluff entertainment, or they're going to think it's garbage. This is just trash. So, we have a much nicer view of pulpy stuff now, but then that was not a good thing. But so he's trying to establish it, but then he has this sentence here, and this is what Adam has a question about. I am by no means indifferent to the manner in which whatever moral tendencies exist in the sentiments or characters it contains shall affect the reader. Yet my chief concern in this respect has been limited to avoiding the enervating effects of the novel of the present day. So goes along with what we were saying, that he's and I keep saying he because Percy wrote the preface. But Adam's question was more specifically, were novels of that time particularly didactic or moralizing? If so, any examples come to mind? Is she rebelling against that style, or just cautioning people not to get too upset, or going to a moral panic over the behavior of Victor and the creature? Like the preface is a trigger warning, like, be careful of what's coming because this is going to be really scary stuff. There were novels that were moral and didactic, and that's a kind of whole beginning of the novel from the 18th century well into the 19th, I mean, maybe all through the 19th, is this idea of the difference between entertaining in fiction and educating in fiction. And many people didn't think that fiction was a proper thing for anyone to read. And go ahead. Did you have something on that? No. Okay.
No. I'm enjoying.
Yeah. So and that is part of what Percy's writing about here. That this is, there are people who find that this kind of work offensive and demoralizing. Scary stories are demoralizing, that they affect your morals in a bad way to read them.
That's something that changed. I mean, that's it ties into what I was, I'm here for the pop culture component more than anything else. Like I said earlier about how genre pictures have never been taken seriously, and even you get a writer as prolific and as lauded as Stephen King, but his books aren't real books because they're scary books. The notion of we accept pulp a bit more now, but it still isn't legitimate literature or legitimate film. And that it's interesting to see how that goes all the way back to when this stuff was starting. Like now, Frankenstein is regarded as a magnificent work of literature that we're talking about here, and there are classes at universities on it. And at the time, while it had a decided impact, it's junk fiction.
And not only at that time, like Frankenstein doesn't get studied in schools until like the 1970s. You say it start to pop up, but it really becomes stronger, into the 1980s and 90s, that it becomes an established high literary text that you can learn about in school. So it takes even longer for this novel to be accepted in an academic setting. So, but clearly Percy wants people to do that right off the bat. So, and that's what he's writing about in this thing, that he wants to, at once say, this isn't one of those kind of didactic moralistic books that you usually would read, but we, do think that this is an important novel of ideas, not just a Gothic, Gothic scary fun. So, and then at the end of the preface, we get that little bit of this of how Mary came to write this, what inspired her. I passed the summer of 1816 in the environs of Geneva. The season was cold and rainy, and in the evenings we crowded around a blazing wood fire and occasionally amused ourselves with some German stories. I should have asked you to read this. I'm sorry. But it's that very basic little story of the genesis of Mary being inspired to write this book. And she goes into more detail in the 1831 introduction for her version then. So this is just a little bit, but it's basically that, the summer they spent at Villa Diodati, well, they weren't living there, Byron was, they were living in a cottage, walking distance away. But they spent all this time with Byron and his Villa Diodati that he was renting on the shores of Lake Geneva, and with John Polidori and Mary's stepsister Claire Claremont, and because of the bad weather, they read ghost stories. You know this whole story, right, Dan?
Oh yeah, this is. I mean, for anybody who grows up on Frankenstein, this is lore. And in fact, they've made a couple of movies out of it, of course. Gothic being
and Russell's Wacky Gothic, 86. That's a great movie.
Yeah, great movie. And it's even as far back as the Universal pictures. Like it's in the beginning of The Bride of Frankenstein.
The opening of Bride, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is hilarious. Who's that actor that plays Byron rolling his R's? He's hilarious.
Oh, he's wonderful. It's Gavin Gordon.
Yeah.
Gavin Gordon who does that. Yeah. And they boil it down to just the three of them. Like Polidori's gone, and the big windows and the greyhounds. Very romantic, which I think they told some ghost stories, but from what I know historically of the people in that house, I'm sure there were other activities that were keeping them busy as well.
Well, it was The TP actually in the Q&As wants to know he heard that 1800s novels were considered women's work and poetry was considered men's domain. Is that accurate? That's fairly accurate. It's not that there weren't women poets at the time. There were, but they weren't nearly as they didn't have the respect factor that men did. But even in novels, the women didn't have the respect factor that men had. As soon as Walter Scott stops writing poetry and starts publishing novels, which is just before then, it's 1812. He publishes Waverley in 1814. I can't remember. He is automatically the greatest selling author in all of Europe, because he is already an established poet, male, and he writes books and everybody buys them. And yet there are women who would write novels then who would sell enormously well, but not at that level. The there's it's very complicated when it comes to novels because there are so many women novelists, but they really aren't accorded the same respect that the male writers are at the time. And if we head back to the preface, it is or the Villa Diodati trip that summer. Yeah, they were telling ghost stories at one point, definitely, and they were reading a book of German ghost stories translated into the French called Phantasmagoriana, and they were reading these stories, and then it's likely Byron, because not only do we have the account from Mary, but there's an account from Polidori that is separate from hers that says the same thing, that Byron proposed a ghost story competition amongst them all, and that they would all write a ghost story, a scary story, supernatural story. We don't know if Percy wrote anything because nothing has survived, and probably didn't, because he doesn't write scary stories. He writes poetry, and like poetry, like capital P, like standing up, with your hands out, gesticulating kind of poetry.
And a couple of very unreadable plays.
Yes, but even his plays are not even supposed to be performed. They're like closet dramas, like you're supposed to read them, so not perform them. Byron writes a little, starts to write a story, but stops. And then that story winds up, the idea of that story, Polidori takes later and he crafts into the vampire. And it's the first vampire in English fiction. And it's called Vampire, Vampyre, the Vampire. And when it's first published, it's published as being written by Byron, and everybody thinks that Byron wrote it. He didn't. Polidori wrote it. Polidori gets mad. I wrote that. Byron says, I would never write that. That's crap. But publishers will keep publishing it throughout the 19th century as by Byron because that'll sell better. And Byron is the new best-selling poet after Walter Scott retires. One of the reasons Walter Scott retires from writing poetry is because of Byron. He's like, I can't compete with that guy, and starts writing historical novels. So Byron writes a piece but abandons it. Polidori does write a piece that they say that he writes, but it doesn't survive, about a skull-headed lady or something like that, and it doesn't survive. But he does write The Vampire afterwards, inspired by this. And Mary's stepsister Claire doesn't seem to have written anything either. Nothing has survived, and I don't think the journals for Mary or her stepsister Claire from that summer actually survived. We have their journals from before, we have their journals from after, but then they don't survive. So maybe Claire did try to write something. We have no idea. But Claire had never established herself as any kind of writer. Only, she would write letters, of course, but not never tried to publish anything or pursue that line. So as far as I know. And Mary comes up with this, story. And when we hit the 1831 intro at some point, we'll talk about her being inspired to it, this waking dream that she has, and it becomes Frankenstein. The coolest part about all this story to me, though, is the weather. And it's even mentioned here, the weather suddenly became serene, and because first it was stormy and then it's serene. A volcano had erupted the year before, Mount Tambora, and thousands of miles away, and the ash, that goes up into the atmosphere, affects the weather throughout the earth, and extremely. There are the average degrees in that summer drop precipitously, and there's crop failures and cold and frosts in August, and then famine, results in that. In a lot of these places in Europe, even as far as America, there were crop failures in America as well. So it's really a worldwide event that happens, and nobody knows that at the time. They just think this is the summer with the crappiest weather ever. Now it's referred to as the year without a summer, and they didn't know why, but they certainly were stuck inside all the time because it was cold and stormy and rainy, lots of thunderstorms too, especially where they were. So, which has an impact on this. But just think, the volcano doesn't go off, Frankenstein never gets written. Like they're not stuck in the house. They're out on the lake enjoying themselves out in the sunshine, and nobody gets the idea to write this stuff. So does Mary ever get inspired to write Frankenstein if that volcano doesn't erupt? So thank you, volcano. And I shouldn't say that because a lot of people died when the volcano erupted. So I take that back. So I'm not in favor of volcanoes. So erupting and killing people. Justin asked a question: why does Percy sign the preface Marlowe, September 1817? And that's not actually in every edition, but it is. Marlowe is actually where they were staying at the time. It's a house. They were staying at Marlowe. It's a house they were renting. Or no, it was his friend. Was it Hoggs? No, it was one of his friend's houses, I think, that they were staying at when he wrote that. So, and John asked, was one of the German authors they read E.T.A. Hoffman? Not to my knowledge, but I don't know if they had read him while they were there. So. There was, there is no record. TPS, is there a record of the story Mary told at Diodati, the first draft of what would become Frankenstein? No. But here's what happens. She gets this idea to write this book, and she does. We are like going to be packed into 1 hour of just talking about 50 minutes of just talking about the book in a minute, about these letters. Sorry. She is, what's the question again? What was that question TP just asked? I just deleted it. TP, put your question back in there again about do you remember what that question was, Dan? Did I say it even out loud?
No, I got caught up on you. This is my favorite part of this whole thing, is I just get to sit here and go, damn it, Ed knows what he's talking about.
The record of the story that Mary told at Diodati, the first draft will become Frankenstein. Yes. What happens is we know that she comes up with an idea for a story. We don't know if she sits down and is like, here's my story. She tells the beginning and the end, but she certainly comes up with the idea for the story. She starts writing it as a draft of this story over the rest of the summer into the next year. And at some point, she and Percy realize this is a novel. You've got to keep going with this. And then she expands it into a novel. And it's still a short novel, but then she expands it at some point. We don't have a separate draft for the very first thing that she created, but she did change some names later, and we have vestiges of names that must have been names in her very first draft that show up in the later manuscript that still exists for it. So it starts as an idea that she tells everybody about, and then she writes maybe a shorter version of it, and then expands it into a novel that that winds up being the published story. So, and it's not very far from, she's only working on this, and what she begins with, her conception, is not radically different from what she finishes with. So it's not quite a first draft. There's enough There's enough correction. Well, there's enough corrections in the manuscript, but it's still a first draft because that's all people ever did. They wrote first drafts and they published them for thousands of years. They wrote a first draft and published it. 20th century rolled around and it was like, no, no, no. You got to rewrite that 100 times before it's any good. And nobody ever did that in the past. All that classic lit you read were first drafts. So, including Shakespeare's plays were probably first drafts.
There's debate about that.
Anyway,
in my other life as a Shakespeare scholar.
Anyway, this is actually good though, because I like we get hit with a lot of questions too, and I'm happy to answer them. But we are going to start hitting these letters, and before we do that, we'll take a little mid break, in which I'll tell you about a couple programs of the Rosenbach coming up, and then because we finally get into talking about the letters, I want to dialogue with you and I, Dan. So stop listening to me and start interrupting me.
Right.
But first, we'll take a break just so I can tell you about a couple of things for the Rosenbach, because we are bringing Sundays with Dracula to you for free, as we did Sundays with. Did I say Dracula first?
You said Dracula, yeah.
I'm gonna have trouble with that. I'm so used to saying Sundays with Dracula.
Slow down on the cocktails, Ed. You'll be fine.
There you go. Oh no, I got it. Yeah, no, I'm not slowing. I need another. We bring Sundays with Frankenstein to you for free, as we did Sundays with Dracula last year. That's what I was trying to say. So if you'd like to donate to the Rosenbach, you can do so at our website. But why not just become a member? If you're not a member now, members of the Rosenbach get free and exclusive access to some programs. There's a couple I'm going to tell you about in a minute that are coming up that you have to be a member in order to participate in them. You get 10% off of all of the reading courses that we do, and you get 50% off of any of the Rosenbach programs that we do. And as I mentioned, the basic membership level of the Rosenbach is actually called the Mary Shelley level. And for those of you who all joined as Dracula Club members last year, because during Sundays with Dracula, we created this Dracula Club, and you can join and be in the Dracula Club. That's actually a Mary Shelley level membership that you got. So that's really great. So you actually can, if you're in the Dracula Club, you're also Mary Shelley level. So you can be satisfied with that, which is very good. And what could be more perfect for you Franken readers to join the Rosenbach at the Mary Shelley level and help us bring the books and manuscripts in our collections to life, as happens in this novel. So we have a few Frankenstein programs besides this show coming up this spring. 2 of them will be members only programs, free for members to attend, but they're only for members. And 2 programs, all virtual, and 2 virtual programs that are open to the general public and that will have a fee with them, but members get 50% off registration fee. The 2 members only programs is a Franken Films program that I'm doing with Dan. Franken Films, Mary Shelley's novel at the movies on March 3rd. And it will be free for members to come and watch. And on April 7th, there will be a Franken Cocktails version, an evening of potable creations that I'm basically going to put together a little Frankenstein cocktail party for everybody on April 7th. And I'll have some guests stop by, virtually stop by, and we'll feature some of the drinks that we've had on the show as well. And maybe come up with a new one. We'll have a brand new drink for that show as well. A couple other programs for the general public as well that anybody can come to, and members get 50% off. We have David Gustin giving a talk called Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, Victor Frankenstein, and the Creature in the Contemporary World. David is the editor of this annotated edition of Frankenstein, which is an edition annotated for scientists, engineers, and creators of all kinds. So the annotations all throughout it aren't necessarily about literary history and all that stuff that I love. They're about science and how the science of the day is connected to this book, and how the science of today is connected to this book as well. It's a fascinating annotated edition. I really love it. And David is going to give a talk on March 18th. And then on April 21st, this is when you're going to be your favorite, Dan. There's a program called Mary Shelley and Her Creation. And it is Jennifer Summerfield doing her Mary Shelley adaptation where she plays Mary Shelley. and then it's going to be attached to Josh Hitchens doing his one-man Frankenstein show, and they're editing them down a little bit, and they're going to add them together. So it's Mary Shelley talking about her life, played by Jennifer Summerfield, fabulous actor in Philadelphia.
Oh my God.
Followed by Josh's outstanding Frankenstein, which I have seen. And they did both of these things at the Rosenbach. Matter of fact, Jen did the Mary Shelley piece first for the Rosenbach. We developed that when we had the Frankenstein Dracula exhibition in 2018. She did that for there. So that'll be really great. I know you've worked with these people before.
Oh, I adore Jen Summerfield. Directed her a number of times. Just such a marvelous actor. And funnily enough, I've never directed or directly worked with Josh, who I also admire so greatly. He assistant directed a show that I did one time. But gosh, I mean, two people, you couldn't have two better people doing pieces for you.
Well, that'll be April 21st. All these programs are on sale or to register for free if you're a member, and they're free for members online right now. So much Franken goodness for you all to enjoy in the winter into the spring. So because we'll still start March 3rd, we're still technically winter when we start that first one, and then as we move into the spring. But for now, let's get, this is at this point at the show every week, this is when we're going to do our collections share. And some weeks I'll be sharing items from the Rosenbach's collection. And then other weeks we will show manuscript pages from the novel. We'll alternate or however we do it. Like in the Rosenbach's collection, we have some Mary Shelley letters. We have the first edition of Frankenstein, 1818. I'll show you some pictures of that now. We could talk about it. And then we have letters from Mary Shelley that she'd written later in her life to people. And we have a manuscript draft poem of one of Percy Shelley's poems, The Fugitives, which is kind of about this young couple fleeing across the ocean from a disgruntled father. We have the draft manuscript of that poem that Mary saved. And we have the manuscript draft of Byron's Prometheus poem, which he wrote in that summer of 1816, that year without a summer. And that has so much to do with this book and the whole Promethean. Byron's writing about Prometheus, Shelley's writing, and Percy's writing about Prometheus. Mary writes a book called Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus. So it's great to have it. And it's actually the draft of it. It's, it's corrected and everything. So we have that in our collection. We'll be sharing some of those things over the coming weeks. And we'll also look at some of the manuscript pages, which are available online at the Shelley Godwin archive. The manuscript for Frankenstein is at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. We had about 10 or 11 pages at the Rosenbach in 2018 when we had our exhibition. It was wonderful to have those in our building, but it's all online for everyone to look at and enjoy. And we will look at them there and at certain parts in the book, and we'll see the changes, especially the creation change, and with the changes that were made to those sentences are really fascinating. So that's what we'll do halfway through the show every week. Let's look at the book that we have in our collection. And here it is in its 3-volume glory. A triple-decker novel. Now, triple-decker novels, or these 3 volumes, are the usual novel format at the time. And one of the reasons that publishers love that is because of the power of the circulating libraries at the time. Books are expensive for the average person. They're almost priced at luxury goods. I mean, if you're middle class, you can afford books, but you still can't afford a lot of books. If you're wealthy, you can afford them. If you're poor, you can't afford books at all. But these circulating libraries exist, and for a subscription fee that certainly people in the middle class can afford, and even people who maybe not make enough money might be able to afford it as well. And you would belong to the library, and you could take out books at a time, but you can only take out one at a time. And that's why they're in 3. That's why they like 3, because they could serve 3 customers at the same time with one book. You'd have part 1 out, you'd bring it back. Somebody else would take it out, you'd get part 2, and then part 3, so you could do that. I think you could also take more than 1 out at some of them. The rules probably varied, but 3 volumes increases the numbers of people that you can serve with one product. You make more money on it. And and the circulating libraries were in cahoots with the publishing world, and it became very problematic as the 19th century went along. The circulating libraries had far too much power over what was getting published and how it was getting published, and the publishers were starting to fight back, and they finally end their power towards the end of the 19th century. But for the most part, they want the triple-decker novel. So people, even when it's a very short book like Frankenstein, they divide it into 3. Well, we'll look at the title page in a second, but here, look at the text on the page. Just like you could fit 3 of these pages in a regular, definitely 2, if not 3, in a regular mass market paperback nowadays. So it is, they really have to spread it out. And Mary actually had written, her manuscript is in 2 volumes. And then when they went to get it published, the publisher said, no, we got to make it 3. So they rejiggered the chapter divisions and to make it a 3-volume novel. But she actually written it originally as a 2-volume novel. So usually, sometimes if you had a really short novel, they will publish it with another short novel, and then there'd be 4. That frequently would happen too. That's Jane Austen's Persuasion and Northanger Abbey. I don't know, maybe that's still 3. Maybe Persuasion was 2 and Northanger Abbey was a 3rd. I can't remember. They were published posthumously. So the publishers loved the 3 volumes, and that's why this is. And even though it's, you really have to spread the book out. And it is published here, and this is the title page originally. It's Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Tighten that up there. In 3 volumes, and it's got the Milton quote. We're gonna read that. Dan, give me a good reading of the Milton quote, Dan.
Great.
I should have been asking you to read earlier. Sorry.
No, please. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? Paradise Lost.
There you go. Yeah, that's Adam, kind of being annoyed at God for making him. And then he's got all these hardships. It's like, I didn't ask to be born, and now you're giving me rules, and I have to suffer for things. But this whole creator idea, the responsibility of the creator to what they create, it's all here. And Paradise Lost it's the novel that almost every single romantic writer from this romantic era, not only romantic as a love story writer, but the romantic era of literature is this late 18th into the 19th century, where they really started to change the way you approach literature and the subjects that you write about. Very confessional. Poets now write about themselves. Developing your own mind is what you do in poetry. A lot about nature, but nature in a very sublime way, where nature really affects you. And all kinds of things that make up this, but by romantic, I mean the kind of works that these revolutionary works at the time that, Byron and Percy and Keats and before them, Wordsworth and Coleridge, and the kind of half generation before were writing. The Romantics loved Paradise Lost, and almost everything you read from a romantic writer at the time is in some way a response to Paradise. This book is a response to Paradise Lost. It is the ideas that Milton is putting forward, especially not just with the creation of Adam and Eve in it, but also with Satan, the fallen angel, who is quite heroic in Paradise Lost. Not a good guy, but still somebody that you kind of admire. I think William Blake said Milton was of Satan's party, but didn't know it. Something like that. He doesn't try to create him as a hero, but he winds up being heroic, especially to people in the late 18th century who were fighting for freedom and enfranchisement and fighting for liberty and
individualism.
Yeah, and Lucifer in Paradise Lost is doing the same thing, but it's not good. I mean, but it's a weird line that Milton unintentionally, I think, crosses over, and that Satan Lucifer, and it winds up being, heroic to a lot of people at the time, and or at least later in this romantic era. And so they all love this book, and they respond to it in all kinds of ways. Published by Lackington, Hughes, Harding, Mayer, and Jones. A lot of publishers there. It's usually just called Lackington or Lackington Hughes. A long-standing publisher that's been around for 25 years or so. Had a big bookstore in London. They did. They would issue coins, their own coins with Lackington, and their founder, I think, face was on it, James Lackington, and it was like their own currency that you could use to like purchase books from them. It's like their tokens or something. It's an unusual system that they would have, but you'd pay for these things, and you couldn't use them at other bookstores. They wanted you to use them at theirs. So, and they published often actually some supernatural books on the occult. So this kind of was right up their alley, this kind of work. Percy is very experienced in the publishing world at the time when Mary writes it. He takes it to John Murray, who was Byron's publisher, and the biggest, most well-known publisher at the time. He published Walter Scott. He published Jane Austen, and he published Byron. When you publish Byron and Scott, you're publishing the two top, money-making authors of the age. Murray turned it down, and then Percy took it to his own publisher, Charles Ollier, and Ollier turned it down. He said, "No, I don't think this is a title that would appeal to our readers." And then he took it to Lackington, and I don't think he even had a connection with Lackington. I'm trying to remember now how he knew to take it there, but I don't think he actually knew anybody there. I think it was just, I'll just try Lackington, and they said yes, that they would publish it. So they put it out. January 1818. I've read conflicting things I've read in some places that people thought that it was perhaps published at the end of December that it first came out, but it's got the 1818 imprint on it, as books come out earlier or magazines come out earlier than their actual date. But I've also read that it was actually not true, that actually it did come out then in January. They tried to release it in December and couldn't. So I'm not even sure. But January 1818, it was definitely on the bookshelves, and people were reading it. So I have a lot of questions here. The volumes were sold. James assumes the novels were sold separately. They come out at the same time. They did all come out at the same time. You could buy it all at once, but you wouldn't buy it in any kind of, like, the boards that we have it in were added later. It didn't come out like this with these marbled boards on front and this kind of quarter calf, leather, here. It didn't come out like that. They came out in very plain cardboard covers that you would take them to a bookbinder and have them published and have them bound however you wanted for your own library. Or if you just didn't have the money, you just wouldn't. You would just keep them in the cardboard bindings, and it certainly wouldn't last as long. But that's how books were sold. They did come out all three at once. You likely wouldn't be able to buy one volume if a bookseller was selling it. You would have to buy all three. So that's about the book. We'll get to that. Somebody asked about the events I said about the Rosenbach. They're all virtual. We don't, even though the Rosenbach's open right now, we're not having any programs yet there. So we're not scheduling any of them yet there. So, all righty. Did I want to say anything else about this, Dan? You don't know. I don't know. I'm just like,
I can't read your mind. I don't know these things.
What? But this is an anonymous book too, and I think that's interesting to mention too, that it's almost conventional to publish a book anonymously at the time, still in 1818. Walter Scott publishes his novels anonymously, although it's kind of an open secret. Jane Austen publishes her novels, anonymously. Part of the issue for a woman is that it isn't necessarily a respectable thing to do to write novels. So especially in England, class really matters in Europe. So it's, but not that there's not already even famous women writers, but it's still frowned upon. It's not quite actor, like as much as people like think actors are horrible, it's, depraved. But authors aren't far behind. So, especially women, if you're a woman author, people, don't think well of you. So a lot of women, Jane Austen published anonymously, although people who knew her and knew her family all knew that it was her by, after a couple novels. But she publishes anonymously. I think it's partly because she is so young. She's 19 when it comes out, and she is the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, and even people, especially of their circle, people that respect these kind of young radicals. She's royalty, and that's a little daunting to come out with your first book then, and it's been expected of her. Everybody who knows her knows that she's going to be a writer. She actually her and Percy had published a little travel book a few months before this. In the fall, they had published a little travels in Europe, their diary from their very first trip when they ran away together. They published that a few months before this. So actually that's her first book. And then this is her first novel. So she publishes it anonymously, but as soon as the second edition comes along, her name's on it. So it doesn't remain that way. She's clearly proud of it. She clearly understands that once it's accepted, she'd put her name on it. And it's true. What if everybody hated it? Well, then your name's not on it. And you can publish something else later and nobody knows it was you. So that's the book. And we have this copy at the Rosenbach. We picked it up in just before 2018, before we had the exhibition. I think it was before I was there. I think 2016 maybe the Rosenbach picked this up. It is a great part of our collection. We also have the rest of Mary Shelley's. I think we're missing one novel, and I can't remember which one. But we have first editions of her other novels as well. So that's the collections share today. I'm only going to talk about the letters from here on out. And we're going to do this, and I'm not going to hit the questions in a little bit because we're going to make sure we get to these. Volume 1, Letter 1 to Mrs. Seville, St. Petersburg, December 11th, 17, we don't know when. Very conventional, the novel at the time, not to give a specific date. It seems clearly to be in the 1790s by what's going on in this. And some of the annotated editions argue over the years, but it's probably 1790s. That's the time that Mary's thinking of in her head as she's setting up this expedition and the things that go on. So why don't you read the first paragraph of that, Dan?
Sure. You will rejoice to hear that no disaster has accompanied the commencement of an enterprise which you have regarded with such evil forebodings. I arrived here yesterday, and my first task is to assure my dear sister of my welfare and increasing confidence in the success of my undertaking.
Kind of, soft opening. No like bum bum, line. It is. We're going to learn who this Robert Walton is, as he'll sign the letter later. Is writing to his sister about the expeditions that he's in Russia now, and he's going to take this expedition off into the north. And as something you've just read again recently, but not in a long time, what was your impression starting this, Dan?
I think the expression that you use, soft opening, is really kind of spot on, because we're at least 2, if not 3 letters in before we even address the characters that are going to drive the story forward. That we do have an establishing of what I suppose, by comparison to what happens over the rest of the book, is a relatively normal life. Now, granted, he's up and, he's exploring and up as far as, as he is St. Petersburg and so forth. But we're meeting at least for me, the contrast, what's the word in the study group? We're meeting the person against whom the rest of the story lives in relief. Yeah. And the thing that really intrigues me over the course of the letters is how plain Walton seems to be, and yet how intrigued he is when Frankenstein shows up and the conversations that they have. He talks about how animated and how Frankenstein speaks very fluently, but very quickly and with great, he's obviously a deliberative thinker, but a very fluid speaker. And how important it is to him to ingratiate himself to Frankenstein to learn this great secret. And the only really ominous drop we get is the glimpse of the large figure, the immense figure on the sledge, kind of making its way across the Arctic, and the fact that Frankenstein spends, once he can walk, all of his time on decks keeping eyes out for it. Like, it's if this were a film, and this shows up very rarely in film, it's a very slow burn opening.
Yeah, not many, Brana puts it in the very beginning. I'm not sure who else puts it in the beginning. Some people will add it, but
it shows up very, very rarely in film. And having it kind of bookended the way that it does, and even Brana can't resist, I think, dialing up the melodrama of it.
Yeah. He starts in a storm, and then they're trapped in the ice, and they're chopping at the ropes, and
But and that's a thing that, like, by comparison to that, because Brana is who he is and kind of lives in that thing, the ordinariness of the opening to me is what makes it compelling, given where we're going. I really like stories that live in, like, that take a left turn that you don't really see coming, and yet somehow manage to maintain the reality of the world.
But this world, this is like still this isn't necessarily an ordinary world here. We're in a moment of extremis,
but it's something that that the readers would have been familiar with.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Explorers, lecturers and then papers and published tracts,
And this exploration of the northern world has been, happening for, over a century at this point. And it kind of in two ways. Number one, the kind of scientific, the ideas that, as Walton himself says, to kind of discover the needles and the magnet and what's going on. And so there's a scientific side to this, which has been happening, but it's also the commercial side too. It's the finding that Northwest Passage, finding a way that you can get from around the world without having to go all around Africa or all the way around South America. If they could just kind of take a shortcut up top of the world, they could do that. But there's also that idea too that he hits on here too about the pole is the seat of frost and desolation, but then it's it's a region of beauty and delight, a land surpassing in wonders and in beauty, perpetual sunlight there, a country of eternal light.
Yeah.
Before anybody been there, there were many people and who thought, and including scientists who thought that, well, it is light there, like either half the year or all year, and maybe it's a paradise. And then there's the hollow earth theories too. The people think maybe the earth kind of goes in and the water goes in there. And Poe writes a great novel about this. Well, maybe not a great novel, but he writes a novel about the fascinating novel to read, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which is going up north. And Walton's right in the mix of them. This is not unusual material for people to read about, and people have been talking about these kinds of things. But even just the language right through there, just kind of takes you in this, puts you in this exploring mode. The vocabulary she uses, it's, enterprise, undertaking.
Yeah.
Inspirited, horizon, navigators, discovered, undiscovered solitudes, discover again, voyage, ardent curiosity, conquer, laborious voyage. I mean, it is, your brain just keeps getting hit with these explorer ideas, this explorer vocabulary. And that's a fascinating way to start a book about a scientist who will explore in different ways to start with, a world explorer.
Forbidden, sort of undiscovered territories, like searching into the dark for things that will make the world a different and perhaps richer, better place. Walton and Frankenstein in that way are dual sides of the same coin. And as I kind of noted earlier, like, Walton is taking the morally acceptable path.
Yeah.
And Frankenstein, depending on how you want to interpret the story, does the other.
And he said, one of the things Walton says in that second paragraph, you cannot contest the inestimable benefit which I shall confer on all mankind to the last generation. I mean, this could be Victor speaking later.
Absolutely.
And
I think it's why, I mean, characteristically, or speaking in terms of character motivations, I think it's why Frankenstein opens up to him. There's a level of kindred spirit that Mary sets up from the jump that I think, if we're going to open with letters, then we have to have a reason to tell the story.
Yeah.
And to create someone in whom Frankenstein sees, if not an equal, someone who can become a confidant, someone who understands the greater desires.
And then John Dalton asked earlier on, he asked, can someone comment on the symbolism of a journey to the North Pole? And that's exactly the thing that we're getting at here. It is this unknown place, this place that you really, that still has to be discovered. And it's dangerous too. It's very dangerous to get there. It is actually impossible. The technology they have at the time, the ship technology they actually can't reach the North Pole.
Right.
And they spend a lot of decades and decades trying to accomplish that. They actually can't do it yet. So it is an impossible task, but they don't know that yet. And the progress that the real explorers keep making will get them closer and closer to figuring it out. And then Walton also has this education that is unusual. And then later next week, when we read Victor's, education at home, it's the same thing, right? He spends his time reading old books and getting excited about them, and poets, and wants to be a poet first.
Well, and it's the same way that the creature develops his education over the course of the book. We've got three mirrored characters,
Right.
I mean, the creature learns to speak by spying other people in the cabin, but it all comes down to books, which is why, for better and for worse, when the creation finally starts talking, it can be a little, to our contemporary sensibility, a little literary to the point of, it's a little florid for our contemporary taste. Maybe that's just me.
No, he speaks like he's walked out of Paradise Lost, because that's what he read.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
He's got that's the diction he winds up with, this high, heroic, poetic diction. That's how he speaks. And so that winds up, the books influence him even in the way he speaks as well. So it's also, he mentions at some point in this letter, or is it, in this letter, the first one, it's 6 years have passed since I resolved on my present undertaking.
Yeah.
That means 6 years ago, when he like this is when he's starting, he's writing about, that's actually when Victor went to school. Like, you can do the chronology of the book, and Victor's at Ingolstadt studying at the time when Walton is taking his first expeditions on whaling ships and things like that and learning the trade. So they both actually start at the same time, and then 6 years later wind up at the same point on the Earth.
Wow.
So
yeah.
Although Victor, in a sense, Victor Frankenstein, completely triumphs in the fact that he says, I'm going to create life, and does, as like 21-year-old college student.
But like any 21-year-old college student, he has no idea how to manage it.
Yeah. And Walton goes to sea, but he's got to spend all these years on different ships and learning and doing all this stuff, and he kind of can't quite do it that quickly. Victor Frankenstein is brilliant. And brilliant beyond anybody's imagination, And that's part of the heroic thing that'll happen later that we'll hit in this book, is that it's so easy to read him as just the monster, like he's the monster, and what he does with his creation and how he rejects him and how he causes all these problems. But he does heroic things in science, and he is so brilliant, and he's such a Byronic hero. Yeah. We'll get to that later. So, but people read now Bionic heroes as a Byronic hero is frequent in modern things, is frequently a bad person. So that the things that they do wrong aren't nearly as forgivable as they used to be. Good is what I say. He also mentions towards the end of this letter, because he has to be a leader to his men, I am required not only to raise the spirits of others, but sometimes to sustain my own when theirs are failing. That's something Victor will fail at completely. That like Walton is a better at doing that, or we'll see what happens at the end of the book when we go back to the letters in Walton. But boy, I love the choice of those words, raise the spirits of others, because that's literally what Victor does in a sense, right? He literally infuses life or a spirit into another being. So in a sense, Victor does do that. He is someone who can create because he can create life, he can generate life. He is raising the spirit of the creature.
And I think one of the great questions that one dabbles with, and I think the book takes a very strong stance, but the notion of the first version of Frankenstein that ever appeared on film was a movie called Life Without a Soul. And so this notion of, while he imparts life to this thing, does he actually give it a spirit?
Yeah. And that's a theological argument that doesn't happen in the book. Like there is.
No, well,
yeah.
And the creature is, I think, very demonstrably a figure of great spirit and great soul, even.
You and I want to talk about the creature. We got to stop talking about the creature.
You know, he hadn't shown up yet, but yeah, he's the flashpoint of pop culture.
Mm-hmm. You got to wait, young man, till you get to the creature.
I know. I'm sorry.
You're stuck with Walton.
I love Walton. It's a great character.
He mentions his sister's name in here, and his sister's name is Margaret.
Yes.
And so her last name is Seville. And of course, her kind of middle name would be Walton. That's her maiden name.
Yeah.
Margaret Walton Seville. MWS, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Now, when the book is published, when she starts to write it, she's still Mary Godwin. And then she marries Shelley, and then she actually doesn't use the name Mary Godwin Shelley. She starts using the name Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. She starts using her mother's maiden name at that point. And that's how it's published at the second edition. But is it accident, or is it unconscious that the initials especially because it's Walton's writing to this unknown female over this is a woman who reads not only these letters, but then the whole book. Like right. She's there reading the whole thing. And that's kind of who Mary is in this. So
she's the first audience member.
Yeah. So they're her, she's reading them all. But it's an interesting little thing. She never mentions it in anything that about the initials maybe, being hers, but it's something that critics over the years have often noticed. So, and I like that little detail of it because I think it's true. And I think in a sense that perhaps not consciously, but perhaps unconsciously, when she's looking for a name, and she doesn't call her Mary, but she calls her Margaret, which is related, and the Walton Seville, and it just kind of all winds up coming together nicely. That's, and writers write out of your unconscious, and your unconscious is driving what you're doing, and you don't even know what you're doing sometimes. So letter 2 is a little later, and this is when he's talking about how he needs a friend, right? I desire the company of a man who could sympathize with me, whose eyes would reply to mine, you may deem me romantic, my dear sister, but I bitterly feel the want of a friend. Mm-hmm. He's lonely and he wants a friend, but he doesn't want any friend. He wants a friend who is interested in the things that he's interested in, and who's basically the same class as him. He writes about the lieutenant and the master, and they're capable men and all, but they're just sailors, right? He wants a guy that he could sit down and talk about these books of poetry that he read, and I think it's a very class thing as well that he's looking for, that he doesn't find within this world that he's in. He is not of their class. He's not a working class guy who has come into here. He's kind of,
and class hierarchy was so important to the English at this time. I mean, we're still dealing in the days when the monarchy was, there's still the monarchy in England, but the queen is, of course, now commonly accepted as more of a figurehead. I'm sorry if I'm speaking out of turn for any of our English listeners, but you know, the class distinctions and the turn of, you know,
hey, we're Americans, we're allowed to do that, aren't we?
you know, but the turn of the 19th century, so much of the literature and the drama from the time period is steeped in class.
And it still is. It's just in different ways.
Sure.
But it's very much. But you'd find less of the, you know, I really need a friend of somebody who is the same class as me now, from general middle class America, or, you know, wouldn't really feel that way. So they're already talking about the bromance in the chat, and I think that's my kids too.
Yeah.
My wife, Kate, super wife, and my daughter Sophie and Lulu are reading this as well. And Sophie actually did the credits. She wanted to put the credit sequence together. They as soon I asked first impression, what did they read the opening, and they were like, Walton's in love with him. Like they are like, it's more than the bromance. Like they were like, oh, it's not a bromance. It is like these men are in love with each other. So and we'll hit that in a little bit when he gets rescued and comes on the stage. I tell I'm going to keep mentioning the 1831 changes to this. There is a slight one here that I don't need to go into deeply, because this is actually the first place where it happens. When Walton's talking about his crew in this letter, he talks about the lieutenant, and then he talks about the master. And it's in the master that Mary makes her first change to the novel in 1831. And she just kind of develops it a little. She develops actually Walton's idea, the idea of who Walton is, a little more. He mentions like, oh, you, my sister, were like, you know, a foster to me growing up. So when I saw this other guy who was generous towards women, I kind of thought that that'd be somebody I'd like to have on the ship. So, but it's not really a substantive change to what's going on in the novel. But that's actually the first place where it happens. But then he has this line here, but do not suppose that because I complain a little, because I can conceive a consolation for my toils, which I may never know, that I am wavering in my resolutions. Those are as fixed as fate. And it's the fate thing that's really going to come up over and over again, especially when we deal with the changes made for the 1831 edition. Fate and free will are a big part of this novel in what Victor does later, what Victor Frankenstein does. I mean, if he's just cursed, like he can't help but do this thing and create this creature and then reject him, if that's his fate, well, then he doesn't do anything wrong in a sense, right? Because it's his fate. Like, how can you escape your fate? But if you're making choices, if it's of your own free will that you rejected the creature, or first that you made the creature, and then you rejected the creature, and then you made other decisions later, if that's your free will, if they were choices that you make, well, then you're to blame. And it seems that over time, Mary Shelley was more uncomfortable with the idea of Victor being just to blame for everything. And she softens it up, especially because there's a lot of Percy Shelley in Victor.
Sure. When it's the great theological question of predestination versus free will, and how much the two tie together. And not for nothing, you know this, Ed, but the first time it was adapted for the stage, it was called Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein. Yeah. So the decision, at least in terms of her lifetime, had been made.
Yeah, and initial readers pick up on that right away. While I don't think the 1818 edition says, you know, that you shouldn't meddle with what you shouldn't, you know, do, and right. that you're fated to, and it's fate that decides your life. I don't think the 1818 edition says that. I think the 1831 edition might a little, but readers at the time were responding in that way, that they were seeing those messages in this book, even though I disagree that they're there when you really look at the text. So and then we get a great reference here. I'm going to unexplored regions, to the land of mist and snow, which isn't the reference, but it's because I hear land of mist and snow, I automatically start thinking immigrant songs, that, but like, dun, 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 come to the land of the ice and snow. So, but it's actually, I shall kill no albatross. Therefore, do not be alarmed for my safety. Albatross is from, do you know this one? Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner?
Yes, the Ancient Mariner, the albatross, yeah.
when Mary was a small child, like 3, 4 years old, Coleridge knew her father and would come to the house and really made a big deal over the kids and like would have them on his knees and talk to them. And he really, very gregarious Coleridge was with Samuel Taylor Coleridge was with children, and really liked Godwin's kids especially. And they would listen to his stories. People knew Coleridge was a great storyteller. And later, when Mary was 8 years old, Coleridge came to visit them. And this was after Godwin had gotten remarried to Mary Jane Clairmont. And Mary Jane Clairmont, Mary Godwin's stepmother, they didn't get along at all. And she was, authoritarian and tried to tell the kids couldn't have any parts of this. And she would force the kids to go to bed, though, and not be up with the adults talking. But before her, Godwin was like, children should hear this conversation. Right. Children should be, raised by, we should be talking about all our ideals, and the children should know this stuff. So Mary and her stepsister Claire, they sneak down and they go and they sneak in a room and hide behind the furniture while Coleridge is reciting Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. And they get to hear it. They get caught and they get hauled off to bed. But Mary remembers this incident for the rest of her life, of going sneaking down and listening to Coleridge recite this poem. Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner is a huge poem at the time. It is very influential for romantics and lots of writers at the time, and Gothic writers too. It is, if you haven't read it, is a poem about a cursed mariner who must wander the world and tell the story of his transgression, the thing that he did wrong. And then he shoots an albatross, and they make him wear the albatross around his neck. Right. But the ship is cursed, and they encounter a death ship, and supernatural things happen, and it's really exciting and fun. But it is a cursed person who is telling a story of his transgression, which is what Frankenstein is going to be. Right. Victor is going to tell he's the ancient, Walton's actually a mariner. It's the, he encounters Victor, who winds up telling him the story of his life and what he's done wrong. And it's the first reference to Coleridge in this book, and there will be others. Letter 3 we'll get through quickly. It's so short, of course we'll get through it quickly. He's on his voyage and they're moving along. But there is a change in this, and the 1831 edition actually has a change. At the end of the letter, Walton writes to his sister, "But success shall crown my endeavors. Wherefore not? Thus far I have gone, tracing a secure way over the pathless seas, the stars themselves being witnesses and testimonies of my triumph. Why not still proceed over the untamed yet obedient element? What can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man? My swelling heart involuntarily pours itself out thus, but I must finish. Heaven bless my beloved sister." Especially that what can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man? That's he's just asking a rhetorical question. He's asking a question which the answer is, well, nothing, of course. Like, it's pointless to even ask it. And if that's the case, if nothing can stop the determined heart and resolved will, that's a kind of fate, right? That means you're not making a choice of what he's doing. And that's the first real instance, I think, of the 1831 idea that starts to change that edition of the novel. That this is a novel about, if you have a determined heart and resolved will, you're going to do what you're going to do. And you can't stop yourself even, let alone have anyone else stop you. So that's the little bit in there. And then we'll get to the meeting here. All right, how can we fit this in 15 minutes? What are some of your notes about this? Well, he meets with, just very briefly, they see this apparition, which is the giant out there. Why don't you read that paragraph? Read about 2:00 and read those 2 paragraphs.
About 2:00, the mist cleared away, and we beheld, stretched out in every direction, vast and irregular plains of ice, of no end. Some of my comrades groaned, and my own mind began to grow watchful with anxious thoughts, when a strange sight suddenly attracted our attention and diverted our solicitude from our own situation. We perceived a low carriage fixed on a sledge and drawn by dogs passed toward the north at a distance of half a mile. A being which had the shape but apparently gigantic stature sat in the sledge and guided the dogs. We watched the rapid progress of the traveler with our telescopes until he was lost among the distant inequalities of the ice.
We'll stop
This
there.
appearance.
I love that. I mean, so they see this shape of a man, which
Yes, exactly.
But apparently of gigantic stature. And there's a little bit in another text. I'm sorry, I have to add this. There's another text of Frankenstein besides the 18 and the 1831 and the 1823 published, in which case William Godwin himself kind of edited a little bit, just helped it clean up some words. There was a book that's called the Thomas text because Mary took one of the first editions and edited it herself, part of it. I forget how much, maybe a third of the book, maybe the first volume, I forget. Part of the book she wrote, she edited it in the book, and she gave it to a friend named Mrs. Thomas. But that book then never made it, those changes never made it into the 1831 edition. She just did that one fresh. This woman just had. So there's some interesting things in that Thomas text. And one of them is that she wrote here, "Are we then near land, and is this unknown waste inhabited by giants, of which the being we saw is a specimen? Such an idea is contrary to all experience, but if what we saw was an optical delusion, it was the most perfect and wonderful recorded in the history of nature." So I like that she at one point she thought, oh, it'd be good if they talked about this.
Right.
And this land inhabited by giants and how talk about it as a specimen, as they would be doing as scientists. So I think that's interesting that she had that. But I love the last line of that too, is that paragraph, is that he was lost among the distant inequalities of the ice. Right. Which harkens to what? Which harkens to the very last line of the novel.
Absolutely.
If people haven't realized by now, there's no such thing as a spoiler on this show, because there's no way to talk about it. Like if we're annotating it, we just have to do that. So I do feel bad if you're reading it for the first time, and I know some people are. There's no way to keep spoilers out of talking. It has to happen in the way you annotate and you connect things as they go along. But that's kind of the last line of the book is a little like that. It echoes this line. The first time we see the creature and the last time we see the creature, there is the same kind of thing going on. Ice breaks up, ship is freed, and then they come across on an ice floe with one dog and a sled. It's Victor. And what's fascinating is no name, right?
Right.
My kids asked this. They're like, why didn't they ask his name? Well, actually, one of them who's watching now, she doesn't even know this is Victor Frankenstein, I don't think. So she just found out now. This is Victor, but we never get his name here. Walton either doesn't ask it or it's just not in there. So the description of him, right? He's a savage inhabitant of he seemed to be a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered island, he was a European, so he was not that. And he's curiously called a human being, but there was a human being within it. That's odd, right? Just as a man, he's a person, but a human being seems overly technical,
right,
and overly concerned with his being, which is what this novel is anyway. Victor, of course, is like, "Where are you going?" Which is what you'd ask when you're, cast adrift in the Arctic Ocean. And they're surprised, but when he finds out they're going north, okay, you can bring him on. His limbs were nearly frozen. Read that upon hearing paragraph.
Yeah.
Please. I just said read that like I'm ordering you. Sorry.
Go for it. I'm looking for it.
On hearing this, he appeared satisfied.
Yeah, okay. Upon hearing this, he appeared satisfied and consented to come on board. Good God. Margaret, if you had seen the man who thus capitulated for his safety, your surprise would have been boundless. His limbs were nearly frozen, and his body dreadfully emaciated by fatigue and suffering. I never saw a man in so wretched a condition. We attempted to carry him into the cabin, but as soon as he had quitted the fresh air, he fainted. We accordingly brought him back to the deck and restored him to animation by rubbing him with brandy and forcing him to swallow a small quantity. As soon as he showed signs of life, we wrapped him in blankets and placed him near the chimney of the kitchen stove. By slow degrees, he recovered and ate a little soup, which restored him wonderfully.
Brandy. People are already hitting in the comments. Brandy. That's the cure for it. It happens in Dracula too. Whenever somebody's sick in Dracula, it's like, quick, it's the brandy. So
well, something I want to double back on though that I've always found interesting about this part, and even more so re-encountering this, is you touched on it. He wanted to know where they were going, and they were surprised by it. And only after he heard where they were going did he consent to come on board. And I love that they use the word consent. And I think it's, at least to me, it's very telling that Frankenstein doesn't want to come on board the ship if it's going back towards civilization.
Yeah.
That he's, as long as it's going deeper into the unknown, he'll come on. Mm-hmm. And it's like, if they had been going back, what was he going to say? I'll catch the next one?
Yeah, all right.
But he doesn't want to draw this.
Another ship one day, so.
He refers to the creature numerous times as a demon, and he doesn't want to draw this demon back towards people.
Well, and his goal now, when they ask him later what he's doing, he's saying to seek one who fled from me. That's his job now. That's what he has to do, and so he can't go backwards. He has to go towards the creature. Although he should have figured out now, as we'll see later in this book, that wherever Victor's going, the creature's actually going to go follow him anyway. So he thinks he's following the creature. The creature's just leading him on. So he should just go to a nice, warm island somewhere, and the creature would come there with him, and then he could relax a little. But he
some brandy.
But the brandy, they rub the brandy on him. Actually, and this is they rub him with brandy, and this is a way to help restore somebody who's fainted. Not just drinking it, although they were drinking it later as well, especially in the 19th century. That's what I need. I need a 19th century doctor. Every time I get sick, it's like, oh, quick, have some brandy. Okay, I'll be fine now. But the words here, right? Victor faints, and then they bring him back to life. And he literally, as soon as he showed signs of life, he is actually resurrected on this ship. Like, we get this like little moment of creation in a sense. They restored him to animation. Victor will later restore a corpse to animation. A corpse will later show signs of life. It's those words show up again in this, and this is something that happens to Victor here. But this really ties into especially the brandy and wrapping up, putting him next to the stove, getting him warm. There's a fascinating parallel with Mary Shelley's own journal that she wrote in 1817, or is it 16? I'm sorry, the dates are fogging in my head now. I think this must be 16, or is it 15? When they run away when they run away for the first time. I think it's 1815. She gets pregnant, her and Percy, she gets pregnant right away, and they have a baby. The baby's born, but the baby dies soon after. And then they have another child, William. And then William is actually a baby during the summer that they're off in Villa Diodati. They have a baby with them. They're all like young and partying and hanging out and all. The baby's probably with the nurse for most of the time. They have a nurse to take care of the baby. But she actually has a baby then. And then she gets pregnant again, and she writes this novel while she's pregnant. And actually the writing period of the novel actually winds up you could look at it like it's 9 months that she wrote the novel too. So the novel itself is almost like a birth period, and it's a novel about creation, and all these wonderful parallels happen. It's also tough too. And especially as Mary is a child whose mother died giving birth to her, or died soon after, 9 or 10 days after Mary was born from the birth. She got infected from the doctor's hands. They didn't understand germ theory at the time, and her mother dies after she's born. So she has this burden in her life that her mother died giving birth to her. And well, this will happen with Victor later, talking about when his mother dies and how, the things he wants to do for that. But the Mary, at the time she's writing this novel, has already lost one child and had another, was pregnant and had another while she was writing it. Or had another and then was pregnant again while she was writing it. When her first child dies, there's a few passages in her journal, which we have from then, and she writes about it. And it's the first is Sunday, March 5. Shelley and Clara go to town, her stepsister Claire. Shelley and Clara go to town. Hogg here all day. That's Shelley's friend Hogg, who's practically living with him right now. Shelley finishes The Life of Chaucer. Hogg goes at 11. Monday, March 6. Find my baby dead. Send for Hogg. Talk. A miserable day. Thursday, March 9. Read and talk. Still think about my little baby. 'Tis hard indeed for a mother to lose a child. Sunday, March. Oops, I have the dates wrong. Talk a great deal, not well, but better, very quiet all morning. And then a week later, Shelley and Clara go to town, stay at home, net, and think of my little baby. This is foolish, I suppose. Yet whenever I am left alone to my thoughts, but do not read to divert them, they always come back to the same point, that I was a mother and am so no longer. A week later, dream, Sunday, March 19, dream that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold and that we rubbed it before the fire and it lived. Awake and find no baby. I think about the little thing all day, not in good spirits. And the next day, dream again about my baby. But that first dream she has, she dreams that her baby comes to life, and she's going to write a novel where this can happen. And but this is the moment in this book where I think it's the first connection with it as well, is that Victor is brought to life and the rubbing him and putting him by the fire. And this is also a dream that she had, that of the care that they give to Victor to kind of just resuscitate him at this point. He's not dead, but to resuscitate him. So a lot of moments like that happen in this novel, and it's they will keep happening. So and I'll bring those out as we can to find those resonances with her life as she's putting this together. That's one of the reasons why I didn't want to go on for a whole hour talking about the whole Villa Diodati and the relationship with everybody all through, is we can hit these things as they come up, as they relate to this book as we proceed over 15 weeks. So the demon, he calls him a demon, but he calls him a demon, the Daemon,
Yes.
which is just more of a, a supernatural spirit. It's a more generic term, meaning like a divine being. You can technically call an angel a demon, but that the
supernatural.
Yeah, the difference between demon meaning only a satanic, devil, and it being an opposite of angel hasn't really happened yet. There is this demon word that the Romantics love. This demon word, you find it a lot in all of their poetry.
Yeah.
There are some significant changes in this towards the end of this letter from the 1831 and the 1818. And I just don't have enough time to get into all of them today. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to write up a post and I'll put it on the Facebook group, comparing at least a couple passages and showing how the one 1831 is really moving into the Victor is fated to do what he must and has no choice, and the 1818 doesn't really have that. But Victor does, to wrap this up, he does start telling his story, right? That he's going to tell a story to Walton, the story of his life. Actually, Walton tells his little story first. He says, right? Yeah, I have related my little history frankly to him, he says. So he's telling his little story. And then, and this is important, I think, because this is the structure of the book. This is Walton's letters about Walton, and then he meets Victor, and then we get Victor's story, and then within Victor's story, we get the creature story. And within the creature story, we get the DeLacy family story.
Yeah.
And within the DeLacy family story, we get the story of Safey.
Mm.
And then Safey goes back to the DeLacy's, and then the creature again, and then Victor, and then we end with Walton on the ship again. So it really, you know, people call it like one of those Russian doll thing, but it's really a telescoping in and then telescoping out again, or it's a sandwich. So this is the bread, and you know, Walton's letter, and Victor's story is actually only the condiments. You know, the creature's the meat and the cheese, and but it's actually interesting as we go along too. Safey's story. If you don't know who Safey is yet, you'll learn. She's actually the very center of the book. And it's almost, you know, by pages too. She's the center of this book is Safey. And then it comes back out again to Walton. It's very, you know, structured very, you know, well in that kind of, you know, symmetrically structured this novel is. Fascinating. This a little bit here is this is where he calls Victor the divine wanderer, which I named my drink for today, and started talking about divine wanderers. What do you have? What notes do you have for the end of this that we could finish with?
I mean, I don't have any specific notes other than the fact that it's such a, I mean, in Hollywood, it would be the wipe. You know what I mean? It's nothing but I won't say it's nothing but there's a very clear setup. I love the fact that Victor recognizes, but almost to a degree rejects the idea of kindness. Like he looks at his own story as if it's a burden, which I think is really interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's the bulk of what I've got. I mean, I'll be very honest. I've never been a great reader for literary component. I always read for like entertainment. So any parallels that I draw are purely incidental.
Sophie asked, do you think that Victor is like an older Walton? Actually, Walton and Victor are the same age. They may be a year apart at this point.
What, 28?
Around the same time, and they're 28, 27 right now. So, Sharon asked a question that I'll throw to you before we wrap up. Is Shelley worked so hard to make us think well of Victor using Walton's impression of him? How does that affect our own impressions of Victor in the text? Curious to get Dan's thoughts, probably because she's like listening to me talk like, Ed, shut up. Given that he's never read the letters before. You've read the letters before, but
I've read them before, but revisiting them this.
Yeah.
I think it is really interesting the way that Walton's letters set Victor up to be an admirable figure. And then we spend the rest of the book learning about what he has done. There's a lot about generating sympathy within literature and drama, but I mean, particularly literature from this time period. And if I can frame it like this as a sidestep, but something that's not entirely dissimilar. I've been doing this thing where I've been doing Shakespeare in prisons and going in and meeting these guys. And one of the guys who has played Macbeth and Julius Caesar for me, I knew what he did. And I like Larry a lot. I like him very, very much. And I knew that he was a murderer. And I'm currently adjacent to this, reading the book about his crimes in which he talks about them. And it's really interesting to encounter what someone has done head on in their own words and grapple with the way that you met them and the way that you want to keep them in your mind. And so I think it's very intentional on Mary Shelley's part, to bring it back around to the book. I think it's incredibly intentional on Mary Shelley's part to set Victor up as this kind of like heroic figure, sympathetic, thoughtful, charismatic, interesting, so that when we follow him on this journey and see the havoc that his actions wreak across the span of the book, our first impulse about him is someone that we want to follow. Because it's hard to follow a book or any story about someone who is reprehensible or whose actions we deem to be reprehensible. Mm-hmm. So if you want my reaction, I think it's very intentional on her part to set him up as a noble, good, fascinating person. So we can face tragedies are all about falls from grace.
Yeah. Right towards the end of this chapter, Walton describes Victor looking at him with his lustrous eyes.
Yes.
Which really calls to mind for me, Ancient Mariner, who has the glittering eye that he holds his, listener, with. Um, and and then we get, fate right at the end of this, right? My fate is nearly fulfilled. I wait but for one event. So Victor, in this, when I was saying the difference between 1831 and 1818, it's not completely, there's no fate in this 1818. There is. It's just it's amplified more in her edits for 1831. And he mentions this fate here. And this is then a question that will come up through the rest of this book, the fate or free will, right? So that's how this letter ends. There's some other really fascinating points. Actually, the 1831 even adds, there's even more at the end of this. Actually, sorry, it's the 1831 that has the lustrous eyes. That's not even in this 1818.
It's in the back here.
So so that's where that comes in. But we will certainly, if I didn't answer your question today, there was a few questions I didn't get to. I will answer them on our Facebook group, or I will send you the. Sharon says thank you for your answer. Excellent, thank you. I will. It may be respond to people privately as well. So there will plenty more talk of this that we can't fit into 2 hours. I mean, I could easily do 4 hours on just what we did today. So we will keep it at there. So Franken readers, and that's what I'm going to call everybody right now, Franken readers. We haven't come up with a term yet. Maybe we could do a poll like we did when we came up with Dracu-Files, but Franken Files is fine. Franken readers I like a lot. Frankenstans, somebody just said, but or Divine Wanderers, I'll call you all. Thanks for tuning in today. We will post this recording on our website, and if you're watching on the recording right now, thanks for watching. We have a Sundays with Frankenstein Facebook group where we continue the conversation. Look us up on Facebook if you're not already and join in that conversation. We have a lot of fun on that group page. I am always available to answer questions via email. If you want to send me a question before a show about the upcoming reading, I'm happy to include it on the show as well. Next week's co-hosts, two joining me. We'll see the return of our friends, the Ghoul Guides from Gothic England, Mary Going and Dr. Lauren Nixon. I can't wait to have them on next week. They're a lot of fun, Dan. You should watch next week. They're really great. That's the show, but especially with three of us talking, I really have to be careful of the time. So the first edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is just one of the many gems of the Rosenbach's collections. If you're looking for more virtual engagement, head on over to the Rosenbach website. Check out the other virtual offerings we have, including our gallery gateways and exhibitions. And the Rosenbach's also open now. We have time tickets for your visit. You can hopefully he's putting it in the chat. Our chat, Igor, Andrew, thank you, Andrew, where you can get a time ticket and visit the Rosenbach one party at a time. So it's basically you got the place to yourself. We have a new exhibition right there right now about exploration as well, about sailing. It's called Manjaro Drifting 1841 to 2020. Manjaro was a Japanese sailor in the 19th century. He actually wound up, he was the first Japanese person to live in the United States. And he wrote a manuscript in Japanese of his sailing voyages in the 19th century. And that's part of our collections. And we have an exhibition of that up right now. So very appropriate for the way this novel begins, is to go see the Manjaro exhibition. Dan, thank you.
My pleasure.
I'm looking forward to doing more of this with you. I promise I won't talk as much in the future. That clearly,
what I'm doing here as much as anything else.
Awesome. So we'll have a lot of fun doing this, and I really can't wait to do more shows with you. Join us next week, everyone, on Sundays with Frankenstein for chapters 1 and 2 of the novel, in which Victor recounts his childhood. We meet the whole Frankenstein clan next week on Sundays with Frankenstein. Once again, we'll be played out by Tucker Christine's Pleated Gazelle song, It's Alive, with a little credit sequence. Farewell, divine wanderers. You have hope and the world before you. Bye-bye.